Patricia. Wait, I'm going to make her a co-host first. Yes, there she is. Oh my goodness. Oh, this is so exciting for me. I've been trying to get Patricia to be a speaker for a couple of years, and she has a really busy schedule. She's not only a regression therapist, but she's the lead for the deep memory process training and also an evolutionary astrology. I've been wanting to do her classes for years too. So hopefully this next year my time is going to free up so that I can be able to do her trainings. And I met Patricia back in the 90s, I think it was. My astrology teacher, Nanette Peterson, in Naples, Florida. So Patricia and Roger would come and visit Nanette. And so that was my first taste of both of their work. And then I got to train with Carol, who trained with Roger. So I got it sort of secondhand, but now we get to have the real deal here. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Patricia, and I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to remove my pen, mute my.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone.
Patricia, unmute yourself. Oh, wait a minute. Unmute yourself.
Okay, just checking.
Okay.
Hi. I just want to check how my screen share is and my sound is before we go on.
It's good here.
Okay, just want to make sure. So I know you're all there enjoying each other's company, but welcome to the symposium, and also those of you who are joining online or afterwards, you can join the private Facebook group. I'm Patricia Walsh, and I'm going to be talking to you today about soul retrieval and regression, which implicitly includes trauma and healing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of trauma and how they impact us through many lives of the soul, and as we understand some dynamics of trauma in current life as well as past life. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I know Carol already told you a little bit about me. For 30 plus years, I've been working in what I call healing work based in shamanic principles. And that's healing work that I started as a hands-on healer. And when I was working hands-on with people, I was starting to kind of, download some of their current life traumas and then track them psychically into past lives. And I could see the same dynamics of what we call soul fragmentation, or what shamanism has brought to us as an understanding of soul loss and soul fragmentation. And then, I wanted to have more of an ability to process that with people, because what I find, and I know people that practice soul retrieval in a kind of, it's hard to say, this is way too long a conversation, but I won't go too far down this road. But some people that practice neo-shamanic practices such as soul retrieval, often find that there's a limited amount of success in that. And that's even in modern day indigenous shamanic healers. And there's a variety of reasons why that is. Some of it is the decimation of their culture and tribes, because that was all an intrinsic part of the human psyche's way to be able to reintegrate fragmented parts. And another part of it is that some of these things that lie within the recesses of our soul, some of these traumas are so deep that just going and grabbing the parts and bringing them back isn't enough. And I'm going to explain to you why in a moment. So in my own experience, I wanted more of a direct, where the person could do the retrieval process themselves, which then led me to Roger, who I met, and then I trained with him, and we worked together as professional partners, teaching and sharing practice for 20 years until he passed away, and I've been continuing the training program. Now, through all of that work, I collected thousands and thousands of case studies from myself and from workshops and from students and so on. And because I had crossed it already with evolutionary astrology, I wrote this book, Understanding Karmic Complexes, which combines these two very kind of divergent yet very symbiotic techniques. And, I collected several thousand case studies and then wrote this book so that to a certain degree, it's as empirical as you can get when we're talking about two, esoteric subjects such as astrology and past lives. So anyway, let's start here. So this is just a simple saying by Faulkner that says the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. And I think in today's society, we tend to think, and I'm using that word intentionally, we tend to think that if we are over something in our head, that we are over it. And a lot of what I would call our reductionist, materialist society agrees with that and condones that. Basically, saying to us, get on with it. Again, a variety of reasons why, you're supposed to be a productive citizen. We don't honor the depth of the psyche collectively. I know groups of us do, probably all of us gathered here do, but collectively, it's not so prevalent in Western society. So we tend to get this idea, and then our therapeutic models follow that idea that, if we think we're over it, we're over it. Well, the reality is we're not. The past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. And, part of this is a truism in the way that the subconscious functions. So if we think of, and I'll probably cross-reference to some of the things of shamanism, like the 3 worlds of shamanism. If you're not familiar with that, they talk about, many indigenous traditions talk about the levels of reality and the levels of our consciousness having 3 main levels. And that's the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And in those 3 levels of consciousness, we can make a sort of loose correlation to what Freud called the superconscious, the preconscious, and the subconscious. So the preconscious layer being that which is aligned most to our present day awareness, what you're doing right now, paying attention, so on and so forth. And then that is the dividing line between what we might call in more New Age circles or alternative circles, our higher consciousness, and what they would call the underworld would be more of our subconscious. So part of the dynamics of the subconscious is that it contains memories that are out of the range of the conscious mind or not readily accessible to the conscious mind. The preconscious, this middle layer, acts as a kind of membrane so that you're not flooded continually with subconscious content. The preconscious, I make an analogy that it's a bit like a browser cache. The preconscious has memories in it that the conscious mind can readily recall, right? So the conscious mind can readily remember where you grew up or where you went to school. You're not actively using those memories right at this moment. But if somebody turned around and said, well, where'd you go to school? You would say, oh, I went to blah, 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 elementary school. And that would be something that the preconscious acts a bit like a browser cache that can go to the subconscious and get those memories. And then there's other content within the subconscious that goes beyond just those kinds of memories, but the kinds that are repressed there because they are not evenly or easily integrated into conscious reality. And quite frequently, that involves a level of traumatic content. So something that was perhaps shaming to you, or we'll just talk about present life dynamics, because every dynamic that applies to your present life psyche also applies to your past life psyches. So all of those things, the way that trauma imprints you in the current life, is relevant to your past life selves as well. So if we think about, a time maybe when you were shamed, or you were rejected, or you were abandoned, or you were betrayed, those kinds of experiences, can cause us not to want to feel that pain, right? Not to want to live in that state of shame or embarrassment or whatever it is, or even anxiety, and repress that content. And this is a survival function. There isn't a judgment in this, that we do it. It's a natural function of the psyche. And then the conscious mind kind of actually likes that, because the conscious mind, which I liken to daytime consciousness, and the subconscious is a bit like nighttime consciousness. The conscious mind has a job, which is to help you navigate through the world and hold down a job and raise your family and, learn and experience and do all of those things. And imagine if you didn't have, and in fact, we can see when you don't have a healthy division of those three worlds, we see people that are overwhelmed with content of the subconscious in extreme, in extreme pathological mental states, such as schizophrenia or, dissociative identity disorder. We can see people that are flooded constantly with the content of the subconscious, which then also brings us to an understanding that the subconscious is not just your individuated memory, but it's also collective memory. And this is something that Jung talked about. Jung talked about that all archetypes are held within the subconscious, and it's through the archetypal realm that the individuated conscious opens to the collective unconscious. So, speaking of Jung, this is a dynamic that Jung talked about when he said that where a complex forms, and I'm going to use the term complex sort of synonymously with trauma, because, I'd say synonymous, but they're two components of the same thing. A traumatic event will cause a complex to be formed, and this is what Jung was talking about when he said a complex forms where we experience a defeat in life. So when we think about, say that this is us, right? We have a soul, we have a will, we have intention, we have desire, and we're kind of, going after what we want. I call that healthy life force. That is healthy libidinal life force. Right? Wants to do something. This is how we get through day-to-day life. In astrology, it's the principle of Mars. It's personal will. And then, so here we are going through life, and then we experience some kind of block. We experience some kind of defeat. Jung used that term in general, defeat in life. And again, that can relate to something on the physical level, right? Like an abuse or an attack. That can relate to something on the emotional level, like I said, like a loss, a betrayal, a shaming. That can relate to something on the mental level. Somebody says, you're stupid, or you were raised, somebody going, oh, you're stupid. And so all of those things can cause a shutdown of part, or a repression of part of the psyche when you experience that kind of opposing force, right? When you experience this wall that you run into. Now, PTSD, what we call PTSD today, is understood as part or intrinsic within the dynamics of PTSD, it's understood that there's these functions, natural functions of the psyche. When one cannot fight or flight, which is a natural will instinct, right? Natural libidinal instinct. Something is happening to you. You're walking down a dark alley and somebody's following you, and then all of a sudden you run into a dead end in the alley and you turn around and this person is holding a weapon, and you can't fight because you have no weapon. You can't flight because maybe there's no way past that person. There's a freeze that happens. So when you can't fight and you can't flight, there's a freeze. And when that freeze happens, because the initial impulse of the natural libidinal impulse of wanting to protect oneself by either getting away or overcoming the obstacle or attacker, whatever it is unable to be complete, the impulse that was in there goes underground. And by that, I mean it goes underground because it's frozen. And it goes underground because it's unable to be expressed. And it lives in the subconscious in the state that it's split off, right? So this is when we talk about, and I'll use it, I've worked with many veterans, and I'll use that kind of example because it might be something we all maybe not experienced but can understand. An 18-year-old who goes to boot camp and then is sent off to Iraq and has never, they've been trained, but there's no amount of training that's going to prepare somebody for the horror of battle. And there they are, and they're in Iraq, and they're in a battle, and even if it's not to them, but I've had this experience with veterans a lot, vicarious trauma, watching a buddy get blown up, or the Humvee runs over something and they can't save them, or whatever it is. A part of the psyche there, either wanting to run away or protect, cannot complete that action. And all of the adrenaline and force and everything that's in that moment freezes and gets shut down underground. Right? And that's that spinning feeling that people talk about when they experience a trauma, because it's like a part splits off from the psyche. And this is what shamanism is called soul loss. But to me, soul loss, in my experience, is actually two-part. And in the next chart, I'm going to explain that to you. But just to give it to you shortly, this part goes underground. It's instinction. It's frozen instinct, goes underground, and another part floats away or watches the event from the side. And I'm sure all of you have heard that in either, people's recounting of traumatic moments or even some experiences of your own, where they watched it from the ceiling or everything slowed down. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of surreal spinning moment. Everything slows down. And then what the literal picture of it, the energetic picture of it, is this whatever that you wanted to do in that moment, either, get away or, fight off, whatever it was, goes underground and the other part floats away. And then what's left of your consciousness is there, and generally it's the body, mostly the body, is left there to experience the impact of the trauma. That's the diagram of how PTSD forms. And back to my example of soldiers or veterans, they come back and they've had these traumatic experiences where there's been this splitting and dissociation. I remember working with a young man who came back, actually the example that I was talking about, came back from Iraq and did watch a Humvee explode with his friend in it, or one of his troop in it, and couldn't get to him. He was by the side of the road and was so traumatized by it. And he was telling me about that experience. And because he was not in a standard therapeutic setting, like the VA hospital, he kind of, recognized that maybe he could say things. He leaned forward and kind of whispered to me, it's going to sound crazy, but it's like a part of me is still standing by the side of the road there. And of course, I affirmed that's because it is, right? And this is what this ancient indigenous knowledge of, that we would glean from the understanding that past or archaic ancestors brought to us through the forms of shamanism. That's what they really understood, right? They understood all these dynamics of trauma and splitting and dissociation, and that putting oneself back together after such an event is not a simple task, and medication isn't going to do it, and most of today's modern therapies are not going to do it. Because, again, many of them collude, well, this is a longer discussion, many of them collude with the dissociation, but many of them also rely only on the mental body to put the psyche back together. So let me give you a bit of I don't know if I need to stop and get any questions because I'm giving you a lot of complex material. I don't know if that's something we want to do. Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, hold on one second. We have a question here in the audience. Go ahead, Monica, and I'll repeat it.
So I have a friend who went with that, right? And he's got leg pain that he's just been suffering with. And then when he had surgery on it, and he went from like a 10 to a 3, and they said, all right, so his pain level could be a 3 for the rest of his life. And he's totally a believer, and he's done like regression there. He's done HHT and all that. So, but if he pursues like therapies through our types of therapies, could he expect to have real healing in this lifetime?
Could you hear that, Patricia?
Was it about an amputation? Is that what she's talking about?
So he has a physical ailment, which has been reduced through medical treatment from a 10 to a 3. And the medical doctors say that that's, going to be his life path down to a 3. He's open-minded to these alternative treatments. In your opinion, do you think that he could use these to help him reduce the pain level and quality of life?
Well, that's varied, and I don't think anybody could give you 100% guarantee on that. When something becomes somaticized, i.e. concretized within the physical body, sometimes it's necessary to have, physical approaches to be able to release and unwind that. It also depends on the origin of the trauma, if it was just this lifetime or is there other content within there. And it depends on the technique, right? So the technique first, I would say, if you're going to do any kind of what I would even call just trance state therapy, which we can put regression in that category, as well as many other therapies that are opening up the subconscious and allowing that kind of realignment to come, that I'm about to describe in a moment. If we can allow all of the subtle bodies to be included, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, then possibly. A lot of it depends on the technique, but there's more, there's definitely a lot of variation in there.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is an anatomy of a soul fragment, or how soul loss happens. So as I was saying, when an event happens, and I'll use one that's tragic, yet unfortunately, I'll use an example of one that's tragic, yet unfortunately prevalent within our modern society, which is child abuse. So let's say, it's a 5-year-old and father is an alcoholic, rageaholic, and is abusive perhaps to several members of the family, including the child. Well, clearly a child, as we know, cannot fight and cannot flight, generally. And so the dynamics of how that PTSD and that trauma sets in, are very easy to that psyche, or again, because of the helplessness of a 5-year-old. So, let's say that the father comes home and, throws things around and just, beats on the child or something. In that moment, this is kind of what would be happening. This is the diagram of that moment. In that moment, the young one, the child, would have natural impulses, regardless of how old the child is. We all have survival instinct, right? And we all have instinctual. And again, that instinct is to either get away or to protect oneself. Because they're unable to be enacted upon in the moment, that freeze happens. And that freeze, as I said, goes underground. So this would be the core of such a complex or a trauma. That's the first thing that goes underground. And then around it would be the traumatic thoughts, feelings, and emotions in the moment. And quite frequently, as we know, with victims of all kinds, there's a blaming of oneself that can go on either in the moment or afterwards. There's a self-criticism or a self-deprecation that can go on, like, oh, I was a bad child, or it's all my fault that he's mad at me, or I'm unlovable, right? All of those things can happen. And then the feelings and the emotions that come with, or actually it's the feeling and the emotions that precede the thought. I'm going backwards, but let's just say in that moment, father's being abusive, and the feeling, of course, would be, horror, shock, sadness, grief, whatever it is, and also anger. It could be rage in there as well, right? And that's totally unacceptable. This is the point that I was making before. Things that are unacceptable to the conscious mind or unable to be enacted upon within the real world in that moment, they all go underground, right? So 5-year-old being rageful at father is clearly unacceptable. It's not going to get them anywhere. It's only going to get more abuse. So that goes underground. It's a valid feeling, right? But it's impossible in the moment. So all of that then becomes a kind of what I would call a moat around the castle, right? All of that becomes a layer that lays around this initial raw instinctual impulse, and it becomes a defense, right? Or it becomes the underlying content of the defense, right? And then the outer layer, the outermost layer, is the defense, because then what happens after the trauma, then there's that, I'm not going to feel this, or there's that, because now the splitting has happened and all of that libidinal life force has been repressed, there's a kind of numbing and a shutdown. And if you see people that have gone through, especially repeated traumas, like those that are held captive or prisoners of war, when we can start stretching this back into past lives, right? Victims of genocide or continual abuse, somebody who's been abused. Then we see that there's a kind of vacancy, right? Like that person has become numb and shut down. And that is a survival mechanism. Yet what happens is that the defense, this outer layer, this numbness, this denial that it even happened, right, which is also a defense, or just the shutdown, holds all of this in place. And simultaneously, while this is going on, and back to the example of the abused child, simultaneously, when this is going on, another part of the psyche splits and kind of flies away. And I would call this the counterpart to the healthy life force potential. So when I do soul retrieval with people through regression methods, either present or past life, it's essential to do both of these parts to reunite the split psyche, right? Because this split has gone on. Now, traditionally, when people think, or I would say in neo-shamanism, modern day, what's kind of become westernized, when people think of soul retrieval, they think about, the shaman taking a flight, in the psychic world, in the astral world, journeying to find this part that's gone away and bring it back. Well, by this diagram, you can see it. You can't just shove it back in there without clearing the defense, expressing all of the thought, feeling, and emotion, and realigning it with the impulse, which is very physical, right? The impulse is so instinctual, it's below the threshold of consciousness. You can't cognate your way out of that. It is a simple inaction, right? And this involves often cathartic methods to be able to reach what was this frozen impulse, right? So if I were working with somebody, which I do a lot in my practice, if I were working with somebody who experienced an abusive childhood, we would regress back to that event, right? And that person needs to be, and here's part of the clue, as I said, this in the subconscious, when something splits off, to the subconscious, everything is happening now. There is no past, present, and future, which is why when people have PTSD, right? For example, let's take our soldier, roadside bomb, kills a friend, is walking down the road after having come back home and the car backfires and he's back in the moment, right? Back at the roadside. Not often by memory, but by what we call affect. So all of the anxiety and the trauma and the instinct and all of that rushes to the surface, temporarily overwhelms the conscious mind, right? And that's what they medicate them for, right? That's what they do to treat PTSD is like, well, we'll just numb you down, right? We'll continue to numb so that content won't poke through the surface again when you're triggered, right? And the other thing about the subconscious is that, and when I would say that this is all very subconscious content, right? We might be able to touch into some of these thoughts because they'll exist as a complex. So, beaten child who says, I'm bad and unlovable, will continue to exist as a complex through the entire life. And they will avoid relationships or sabotage relationships or form relationships with continued, this is most common, trauma repeats itself. This is also part of the dynamic of PTSD. And so form relationships with future abusive people, because all of this is still subconscious and it's kind of running the show when we have this repressed material. So all of these dynamics apply to your past life selves. These dynamics don't go away in the afterlife, or what we would call in our work in the bardos. They may, on certain levels, be able to, or you may, that's a longer discussion, too long for this talk, but mostly what we find in regression work is that if you experience some sort of trauma like this, that splitting, this splitting happened in a past life. And so there are frozen impulses there that need to come out and be expressed. There are thoughts and feelings and emotions that need to be re-expressed and re-experienced. This is a key point, right? And to get to those, you have to get through the defenses, right? Because these defenses will also continue. I find many people in regression that I've worked with over 20, 30, 40 of their past lives, their psyche has their favorite defense, right? Like, there's the denial types or the numbing shutdown types or the, and I have my own, right? We all have our own defenses. Again, there isn't a judgment about it, but it's just that, if it worked in the past to a certain degree, the psyche is going to get used to using that one. And so those defenses also become very concretized within the psyche, within the soul. And then, as I said, this counterpart that kind of flies away and goes away when it is retrieved and brought back after this kind of root canal. I consider this like a cathartic, the root canal has to happen before you put the filling in, right? When this kind of root canal has happened, then this part comes back, and quite frequently this part that has flown off is the part that holds some gift or some quality that was, again, unable to survive that moment. So back to battered child. Let's say it's a 5-year-old's innocence. Let's say it's a 5-year-old's joy of life. It's the ability to be whatever. And in place of that part that went away, that's up there, this becomes the assumed reality, right? So that healthy part of the child that knew that they were lovable, yet experience that flies away, and then they become, these thoughts and feelings become the reality moving forward from that moment. I am unlovable. I am bad. It's all my fault. Those kinds of things accompanied with that deep affect, right? That deep emotional charge that is, they're cemented together. Okay, any questions about that before I move on? I'll take that as a no. All right, so let me give you an example of how this plays out in past lives. So this is a woman who was in a workshop, and this was a demonstration in front of the workshop. It was a training. It was a professional training. And she has had breast cancer at the moment when she was at the workshop, and was in recovery and wanted to work on some of what may be behind that. And in our work, isolating the core thoughts, feelings that are beyond the defense is part of the way that we get right to that core. And so, she had a kind of history. She was a nurse, so you could imagine she was a helper healer type, had a, really big heart, very giving person, etc. So you could imagine, though, that all of the kinds of complexes that can be around that being the helper healer, right? And so in exploring all of that, and then using an induction to go back to where that imprinted, she went back into a life as a kind of medieval peasant young woman who was living fairly happily with her family, father, sister, mother, doing things that medieval peasant people do, grow food, hang out in the village, right? Do all of those things. And then the plague came, or a plague came. And of course, the village, the community is upset about all of this, trying to figure out remedies. And she, of course, had worked with her mother in collecting herbs and all of these things, and she's helping the village. They make food, bring it to the sick ones, and nobody really understands what's going on except that people are getting sick and dying. And so she's very involved in trying to help her community. And then the plague hits home, and it hits her father, and her father dies first. And she's in terrible grief. She's in that moment, in those moments of feeling, frantic about, I couldn't help him, I couldn't save him, I tried. She was only, I'm thinking in this past life, maybe 14 or 15, just a young woman. And eventually it kind of hits all of the, this is this model of the three worlds that I'm talking about. This is with the lifetime, right? This is the earth plane where that life is happening. And so she's there, in the midst of the village. It then hits her mother. And then it hits her sister. And the sister was the worst, because as it got progressive and more threatening and taking, close loved ones away, she went in overdrive of trying to save them, not sleeping, not eating, just frantically trying, and just a nervous wreck. And each time somebody died, it was like a part of her split. But her sister was really like the linchpin. So it was like she was clinging onto her for her last breath, and just, until her body went cold and she wouldn't let go of it. And she was just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And now, we've heard of this, or maybe you've even experienced it in losing a loved one. We use language like that when parts of us go away with those that we've loved through the gateway of death. They took a part. I can't live without them. They took a part of me with them. I'll never recover, right, from these kinds of losses. And so this was really this progressive kind of splitting and soul loss. But we would say that she basically, the big splitting happened through grief, through the trauma of grief, and that part of her died when her family members and her sister died and never came back. And then eventually the plague got to her and she died from it. But she died in that state of already having experienced immense grief and these kind of condensed thoughts and feelings. So the first was, I'm all alone. And the second was, I couldn't save them. So as Carol was alluding to before, it is essential in regression work, at least in the way that we do it and teach it, that this moment of death is really captured, because in all of the ancient teachings on the moments of birth and death, and even some of the modern ones, teachings on birth and death, that these are critical moments for the soul. It's like, squeezing through the eye of a needle, right? So everything becomes condensed. And so it's the same in birth moments, and it's the same in death moments. And the death moment is a bit like a period at the end of a sentence, right? It's a concluding thing. So when she passed from the plague, she had the added grief, like I said, of being all alone, and then the continued grief of not having been able to save anyone. So this is where her soul was. Now, in our work, we would understand this is what I call a Bardo bubble. So this immediate plane after death, right, has several parts to it. But this part of her soul, because it had split off when she was already alive, was still in the underground. So we would say that this part of her soul was still earthbound, just in that cloud of grief and depression and self-recrimination, right? I couldn't save them. So therapeutically, when we work with somebody like this, we need to get that part of the soul to first recognize it's dead, because again, to the subconscious, and if I expand upon that and say that the subconscious is synonymous with soul memory, right? That the soul's memory is there, like I said, the individuated unconscious and the collective unconscious are within the subconscious realm, that all of those soul memories are there. That part of her was still hanging out in that cloud of grief and aloneness. So in our work, we need to wake up that part and say, you're dead, it's over. And part of that happens through the re-experiencing of the life. There's already a level of soul retrieval that if you are able to rerun this story in the now, in the present, you are already realigning these subtle bodies that have become disjointed or misaligned or incongruent. So anyway, here she is in the afterlife, still earthbound. And so getting that part to recognize, and what they don't generally recognize is that this is the part that hasn't gone to the light, right, to the higher bardos. This is the part that hasn't gone even to what we would call the intermediary bardo, which is where they can get help. They've just stayed in that subconscious, everything is happening now place, right? So to this part of the soul, it's still alone. It still can't save them. So in our work, we would work with all of these resources that are available in the intermediary world, sort of like a tour guide, not a tour guide, sort of like a Sherpa, right, who leads people up the mountain. And so, being the one who can help them to know these resources are available to you. Your loved ones aren't down here on the earth plane anymore. They're in the afterlife, and we need to get you, this part of your soul, up to the light, so that now some healing work can begin. And this is a big part of soul retrieval as it happens in regression therapy, because just the act of lifting this part of the soul off the earth plane is a level of soul retrieval. Just popping, what I call popping that Bardo bubble, right? Getting the pin and popping it and releasing that to reunite with the loved ones and work out all of those things that it was unable to do on the earth plane, is a level of soul retrieval. And that's that level of soul retrieval that I was talking about before, that opens up the very core of the complex, or opens up the very core of that formation of the PTSD, so that when they get to this realm, and they are able to meet the spirits like she did. She was able to meet the spirits of her parents again from that lifetime. And she was able to meet the spirit of her sister in that lifetime. And she was able to grieve with them and tell them how sorry she felt she couldn't save them. And then, of course, their response to that was, there was nothing you could do. From the earth perspective, we can carry all of this kind of responsibility and guilt and shame and anxiety. But once you start to get one step up into the intermediary Bardo and look back at it, right, then you start to realize, well, duh, it's true. I was only 14 and, well, it was a plague and there wasn't a lot I could do. So that already starts to relieve some of this content of what I would call the Bardo bubble. But that's through enactment. Again, that's through the treating the memory as we know it lives in the subconscious as now, right? And releasing it with the same kind of method, or not even method, with the same kind of energy in which it was repressed and or split and fragmented. And by that, I mean that if that part of the soul has been floating around in some medieval village, still earthbound, missing its loved ones, and we bring her to the middle world and she's able to re-meet them, her body's going to want to hold them, right? This physical body, which is the counterpart to the etheric body. And that is going to relieve, right? That alone is going to relieve that missing them. So all of this, ability to use catharsis and again, is part of the soul retrieval. And then what a lot of people think of as the objective of regression therapy is then to go to this higher realm to get the big picture, right? The spiritual perspective. Once this part of the soul is resettled here in what we would call the intermediary bardo, and has been able to do all of the things it wasn't able to do, that's the principle of this middle world. Do now, this is actually, in shamanism, this space is more the underworld. This is the middle world. This is the upper world. So this part that's been frozen in the underworld is unfrozen and able to do what it couldn't do then, which is the principle of this. That starts to unravel the complex. So the core of this complex of being a savior, right? And feeling that one has to be driven by this deep guilt and grief carried into the future as this woman today. Right. And so here's the crux of how this played out in her lifetime. Serendipitously, right, or synchronistically, this regression happened on the exact 1-year anniversary of a friend of hers who died of cancer, which she nursed through that. Probably a couple years, it was a year earlier. So I don't remember how long it was prior to that her friend had been diagnosed. But remember, this woman was a nurse and a helper and a healer. And so her friend contracted cancer or had cancer, and she nursed her through that and then lost her. And then on the year anniversary of that loss, she was doing this regression. And she wasn't conscious of that. It became clear in the afterlife when the sister reappeared in the afterlife from that past life. She appeared as her friend that she knew in this lifetime. And this huge realization came to her in this moment as she was looking at her, and her friend said to her, yes, it's true. We did do this story already, right? We've done this before. You did lose me in the past. And she said, yes, it was me. You did go through that loss and you went through it again in this lifetime, but I'm here now to watch over you and to tell you that it's time to take care of yourself. Stop being the savior. And that popped the complex. That was like the final straw of popping this that carried over into her life today as being the superhero savior on overload, which we do know often can be behind, especially breast cancer, right? That complex of needing to constantly give and give and give and give. With all of its emotional content that drives it, behind it. And then after this regression, she did go into remission, and credits this particular piece of work as that. And then also changed her life. She did a lot of beautiful things with her life, journaling and writing and experiencing creative parts of herself that she had not given the time nor latitude nor energy to in her current life, because she was too bound up in this complex running her life, what I would say this complex running her life. And so this is an idea of how this plays out. Now, in this upper world, just to give you a picture of that, this is where you get that kind of big picture from the spiritual perspective. She already met her friend and understood, wow, I've been doing this again, right? I don't need to be the savior anymore. So then when she ascended even to these higher realms and met with the masters and, you know, the angels and the highest wisdom, divine beings possible, in the upper world, there was much affirmation that what her friend had told, the spirit of her friend had told her was true, that she did need to, that this illness was a, was a harbinger of this message of take care of yourself, stop, being the savior. Okay, so just a little bit in conclusion, and then we can come back and have a little discussion about some of these things. This is what Jung was talking about, and this is what I mean when I say that these complexes are not, or these traumas are not simply resolved by knowing about them. And it's, Jung knew this also because he did get a lot of his work from Freud initially, who talked about repressed content a lot, right? And how that affected the present day consciousness, or the existential consciousness. So as Jung was saying, he said, as we know, a complex can be really overcome only if it's lived out to the full. In other words, if we are to develop further, we have to draw to us and drink down to the very dregs what, because of your complexes, we have held at a distance. And what he's saying goes back to my diagram. You need to go to the core where you don't want to go, which is where the terror and the anxiety and the depression and the grief and the whatever emotional content is there, that again, the psyche split off for a reason so that it could get on with life, right? It did it for a reason. It's a natural function of the psyche, but in order to realign all of the content that's held in the subconscious within the core of that complex, and to unravel the complex and the trauma, one needs to first summon the courage to go there, right? And then to draw, as Jung is saying, draw it to us and drink it down to the very dregs, right? That is to tease it open and to give it expression, to give it the place to be able to be reassembled within your current consciousness, again, by reenactment, by going back into it in the now. This is the beauty of regression therapy. Regression therapy, be it only present life or past life therapy, and or both, is the kind of therapy that can bring you back to something that happened either this life or past in the now, right? And it's there where you are opening up. That is where you're reliving it. And again, this is my summation of Jung's thoughts and the work. A complex can only be healed once its emotional content is discharged and assimilated emotionally. And as I always say, either you run your complexes or your complexes run you. And back to my example of the plague, the woman who went through the past life plague, she was run by that complex for many lives. And this is what that savior complex, we could put that whole thing into a package and call it a savior complex. Yet at the core of that savior complex, again, back to the diagram, was all of that deep repressed content, right, of grief and of loss and of guilt. And those are the kinds of things we generally don't want to walk around feeling 24/7. So they are repressed in the psyche, but it's the same with the soul's past life memories that have that kind of content. They are deeply repressed within the soul memory, yet they still run the story. right? And this is something that Jung talked about. He said that complexes are autonomous. In other words, when they split off from the psyche, they have a life of their own. They are living just like that picture of the girl hanging over the tombstone, still hanging out in the astral plane today until that session, feeling all alone and couldn't save them. This is what all of our little split off parts are doing. They're still living within the basement of your subconscious, right? Running their stories. And as they're running their stories, they are subconsciously running your life. So either you run your complexes or your complexes run you. And that is an essence of soul retrieval. And again, as the Master Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Right? So the more that we, again, summon the courage, the ability to be guided through our defenses into this kind of content, make it conscious, exhaust the impulses that are in there and give those impulses expression, and reintegrate them back into the psyche, we are driven by them, and that's often what we call fate. You know, when we can say these sorts of things, we say these sorts of things to ourselves all of the time. Like, you know, I always say, if you want to start to understand your complexes, just finish the sentences, I always or I never. Right? So those are scripts that we believe this is the story, right? So that other woman I was talking about, I always have to do it alone, right? That kind of thing. So when we run those kinds of scripts, they are running our lives. Yet the real content of them, just like Freud's iceberg, right? What we know of ourselves and our reality is just the tip of the iceberg. All the juicy content is under the ocean, and it's up this big compared to this. So we can have some discussion about that, some questions, anything anybody has on their mind. Hello, Peggy. Peggy's raising her hand. Hi.
This is fabulous. Thank you so much. My question is, do you offer training in this?
Yes, it's a deep memory process training. It was on the first slide. It's
was
on
it?
my, yeah, unfortunately my website is not updated because
Okay, because I
been,
was madly on your website as you were
I'm
talking.
sorry. I am doing, I just did a level 1 in October. It was the first one in 3 years since COVID. And I will be doing, launching another level 1 next year, probably in March or April.
Okay.
And I will update the website because I've been building a new website. So that's why it's not been updated. My apologies.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Catherine has her hand up.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, that was absolutely brilliant, and I appreciate it so much. And I have a question about being an astrologer myself. I had a client or a friend who had within her chart, and I'm sure you can relate to this, a very clear indication that in a past life she died quickly and before she was ready to die.
It's usually a Mars Aries complex. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly.
Died too young. Yep. That's the Mars Aries one. Yep.
Mars square Mercury in the 8th house.
There you go.
So she and her mother had died of a heart attack, and it looked like she had died of a heart attack in a past life. And she came in and she was, very talented and everything. And she started having heart trouble and became obsessed, terrified. She was in such a state of anxiety. And I did suggest to her that she get regressed, but she was not open to that. So she lived it out. This is what's so interesting.
This is what's so painful to watch.
Right.
As somebody who knows, just give me 2 hours and we can get rid of that, right?
I know,
But they
I
don't
know.
know, right? It's the fear. This is what I'm talking about. It's the fear
This-
and the terror and the inability to navigate the defense, right?
but this is what's
Yeah,
so interesting about it.
yeah.
She went through a number of years of being in panic and running to the hospital, and
Oh, horrible,
but
horrible.
she got cured. Her heart got cured. She had an ablation, blah, blah, blah. And it's like she had to live out that anxiety.
Well, she didn't have to, is what I
No,
would say,
she didn't have
right? I
to.
mean, but as it became somaticized more and more over time, right, then there was that physical intervention that you're talking about, surgical ablation. And then, I mean, there's probably several layers of what I would see going on with your friend. Or I'm sorry, this woman that came to see you. You know, several layers there would be, yes, her own past life, I died too young. This could also be, and I've worked with people that were on the edge of getting ablation and we were able to get to it. And one of them was a, sacrificed, stabbed through the heart as a young nubile young woman, because that's when they sacrifice them, right? So here you are, you know, you're this gorgeous 12, 9, 11, 10-year-old, you know, Aztec Mayan child, and you're primed for, sacrifice. And so that was part of so all of the anxiety and all of that, as well as the physical wound of this, cutting out of the heart, condensed right into this, whatever, what the symptom was, which was rapid heart rate or whatever it was. So I would say there's that possibility there. And then you have the layer, potentially of an ancestral spirit, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Mother that had
As
that.
well. As
Yeah,
well.
as well. So that's like because here's the thing, in the spirit world, like attracts like.
Yes.
So we are born into families that hold similar ancestral complexes that we
That's
do. It's the
brilliant.
same, right?
Yes.
So this kind of, it's like these layers somebody mentioned before, onions, right? But the way that our complexes are constellated, we have our core complexes, and I always use this image. We have our core complexes, then we have the ancestral familial field, right?
Yes.
Then we have a whole collective racial field. Then we have a collective cultural field. Then we have a collective field, and all of them resonate from our core complexes. Right? Those are the ones we're plugged into.
Yes.
So she's born into this family with maybe a mother who also had that I died too young kind of complex, right? And there you go.
And one other thing about her that was fascinating to see, she was very creative because her ruling planet Mars was in the 5th house square. So she's been an artist, she's been a poet, and she keeps putting out because she didn't fulfill that tremendous drive. Anyway, your work is gorgeous.
Oh, well, you get it. I mean, what you described is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. So you
I think it's just in the atmosphere that we're learning about all of this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you're muted, Carol. Oh, there you are.
We have a question here.
Hey, Patricia.
Hello.
You may said that before and I didn't catch it. Forgive me if it's repeating what you said. Do you see client for soul retrieval, or you are just teaching this stuff nowadays?
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you see clients for soul retrieval?
Yes.
One-on-one sessions?
Yeah. I'm pretty booked out though. And I haven't been seeing people in person. I've been working online for a couple years. Yeah. Just getting back to in-person sessions probably by mid-year this year.
So we can get information from Carol, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's on my website or whatever. I put up that information on the PowerPoint. I
Yeah.
can put it back here.
Yeah, we've shared all of that.
Yeah, it's on the cover slide.
Okay, and we have another question over here. Oh, hold on 1 second. I'm going wacko. Okay, Monica, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, so I have two interesting kids who both came in young, same thing what my son used to say when he was upset. I want to go back home, even when we were home. But my daughter, she used to, when she was younger, like 3 years old, punish herself. She used to go into timeout and we'd say, why are you doing that? And she'd say something like, oh, I dropped the plate. And we'd be like, no big deal. It's fine, Samara, that sort of thing, and even now, so we would be like, we can't punish her because she's overly dramatic with the punishments, it's not everything she thought was a pun she did wrong was really no big deal. And she was so overly sensitive and she literally never did anything wrong. Now she's gotten older, her social anxiety is off the charts, and we're always like, okay, should we really punish her when she does anything, so I'm, and then we would be in New York City and she'd my aunt lives there and she'd run away and he'd be like, wait, hold on. She'd be like, I know this area. So well, you don't know it anymore, so stay with us. So now when I talk to her, she's like, I don't remember. Right. So she's going to be 16 next week. So I'm thinking as we're sitting through all of this, obviously I believe all of this and very evident. I don't know how much to push her because my son is 1,000% on board, but I'm not so sure that she really is. But she goes through highs and lows with everything. She's got serious social anxiety, but I think it may be from previous lifetimes, all of it, because it started when she was, 3.
Well, and this is the point, though. These things don't go away in between lives, despite the picture that we get from near-death research. And I have my theories about that, again, after working, with people's tens of thousands of people's psyches, in 20, 30 years. My picture of that is that, when you die and it's kind of like going on vacation, and you go on vacation and you think, wow, this would be a great place to live, right? and it's all great, and wow, I love this, I want to live by the ocean and blah, blah. And then you go home and sell your house and go and move to this great place you took vacation. And then the truck arrives, and within, 5-6 months, you're back in the same psychic state that you were before. Like all your problems followed you, right? Maybe there's some fresh start, but I think that people that pass and go into the afterlife and then come back they're not fully there. Like they didn't fully move in yet, right? Yeah. So the picture that they're giving us is what the Tibetans talk about in their description of the bardos as that first appearance of the supernal light. So in the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they talk about when you pass, there is this supernal light that appears, but it says if you don't recognize it as your own Buddha nature, then you progress deeper into the afterlife bardos, and they get increasingly hellish as you go on. You get 2 other chances of meeting this light, according to the way that they talk about it. And I'm not going to say that that's literal as much as it's a symbolic description of these dynamics of afterlife dynamics. So to me, these things don't go away. Your daughter bringing in this complex of punishment, I'm going to go punish myself, is a kind of masochistic complex. And quite frequently that goes hand in hand with anxiety.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And, you know, it's, you know, 90% of the time she'll pull herself away from her friends because she's like, well, they don't want to be around me anyway. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
neither them nor her. Nobody's done anything.
yeah.
It's so I'm really thinking,
It's in the subconscious, isn't
yeah,
it?
it is. And it's
Well,
going-
that's a defense, right? That, like I was saying, we all have our defenses. You know, mine when I was younger was, I'll reject you before you reject me, right? So, and that comes from an abandonment complex, right? That was formed by an abandonment complex, that it was like, well, if you don't want me, I don't want you, right? And so hers is a variation of that, right? I'll pull myself away before I feel the pain of the rejection. Yeah, just like I'll punish myself before I feel the pain of the punishment due to me. Again, her thinking, not, you know, not actuality, but her thinking. And another way we know we're in a complex is when we're in a complex, we're either overdoing something or underdoing it. And by that, I mean, when we're overdoing something, it's like what you're talking about with your daughter. It's an overreaction to a current life moment, right? Like, I broke the dish. Now I have to go flagellate myself in the closet, right? You know, whatever it is. Past life monk coming through. Right? So either we overdo it or we underdo it, mean avoidance, which is almost like what you're talking about with the friends, right? I'll remove myself from them because I know some part of my psyche is expecting rejection, right? So I'm going to avoid that. And that's when we know we're in the grip of a complex, or that a complex is running our life. And, you know, as my book was titled, karmic complexes, they're not just formed in the current life, they're formed over many lifetimes.
right. Yeah. And I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure.
We have another question from Olga.
Hi, Patricia.
Hi.
My name is Olga. Actually, I have a 3-part question, so I can start with one and then we'll go from there. So how do you know when the person has a soul loss?
We all have soul loss. You know, if we were running on full battery, we'd all be enlightened and we wouldn't need to be here. Right? Pretty much you'd be running on full wattage. You know, most of us are, first thing, we have collective soul loss, right? But individually, I mean, we're all born with some level of PTSD.
So the second question is, in shamanism, shaman goes, I understand that goes into a different state of mind, and then it goes to the underworld to find that soul loss of a person. So in your work, you regress the person to that trauma back, right? So what is the difference, I guess, or what is your approach? I mean, like, I understand you go back to it and the person maybe realizes something, like, what is the difference?
It's not, this is what I mean about the mental body only. It's not just realization. You can know your complexes, but that doesn't mean you're over them, right? So these parts that are buried in the subconscious don't come out of hiding just because you uncover them and find them there, right? As Jung was talking about, they need to be fully enacted, right? They need to be brought back into the fold of the consciousness. So there's the difference between having, so the two models of, you know, the classic model of shamanism, or again, you know, I want to say this about shamanism, because a lot of us know shamanism only from the neo-shamanistic traditions, which are not really traditions. They're appropriated from cultures and brought to us usually by people who have either become westernized or are Westerners themselves. In the deeper shamanic traditions, in the indigenous they're very hard to find because it's hard to find indigenous tribes that have not been decimated by Western society, unfortunately, that exist in their pure state. But there are some examples. The Australian Aborigines are part of them. But there are some traditions that have carried through. An example of a beautiful example of the way that the indigenous consciousness looks at soul retrieval rather than the way that it's carried forward in the New Age is, and this is a modern example. This was a young man who was a Native American who went to war in Vietnam and came back devastated. And he felt so devastated, he never went back to his reservation land and became one of those people that we know about, that, homeless, drug addicted, alcoholism, all of that. Until somebody from his tribe or something encouraged him to come back to the reservation. And he went back to the reservation, and the elders sat with him, and they talked with him about what happened, and they said, "You've lost your soul, and we need to get your soul back." So they took him out in a boat, and they, you're gonna laugh at this. They took him off in a boat, and they threw him overboard, and they said, "Get your soul back." And as he was flailing in the water, drowning, right, didn't swim, was trying to not drown, this was their way of engaging his will and his life force again. And that was the beginning of his soul retrieval process. That's vastly different than this picture that the shaman goes into a trance and goes off and gets, it's not always in the underworld, it can be in the middle world or the upper world, goes off and gets this part and brings it back, right? So that's their understanding that something needs to engage that healthy libidinal life force that's been locked away. That was their way of doing it. Throw him in the water and tell him, bring him to the point of death to see if he really wants to go on to get his soul back, right? So, okay, sorry, that was a longer answer to it, but go ahead. Next question.
Working with the person and the person doesn't want to go back to that traumatic event because it's too traumatic, like what do you do in this situation?
Well, first thing, our training, deep memory process training, is a 2-year process. It's 4 or 5-day modules. So you don't go away, just for a weekend and become a regressionist. So there's all of these techniques that are taught on how to, how to get by the defense. And the defense is there for a reason. And I discourage anybody to just try to, puncture through the defense unless you can heal what you've opened up, right? Or unless you're in the kind of container. So basically what I'm saying is don't open up something you can't heal, right? And that's why our training is a 2-year process, because we go from, the basics of how to open up the subconscious and these memories, how to bring them to completion, how to deal with the dynamics of trauma and dissociation, how to use the body as the bottom line, right, to realign the subtle bodies as well as the understanding of all of that. And so it's the practice and the understanding of all of that that then can easily bypass defenses.
So in your average, when you work with PTSD folks, how long does it usually take? How many sessions on average? I know everyone is different.
Well, it depends. So in the case of, like, say, again, my understanding, and it's always a part of my work, is that the trauma doesn't always originate in the current life. So even when I'm doing current life work with somebody, You know, to me, there's a possible past life counterpart as to why that was re-experienced or replayed in the current life, right? So I think that sometimes, again, to do the root canal, right? You know, we can go from present life to past life, right? So I can work with somebody on a present life trauma. Quite frequently, it is an echo of something that is already imprinted within the soul. And as Freud talked about, the basis of trauma is repetition compulsion. So we know that that happens through the many lives of the soul. So I would say that the current life, working through the current life and then through the past life, and then the other thing that happens, because there is repetition compulsion, there's usually more than just one life that holds the full charge of the complex, as well as the fact that memory is associative and it kind of stores all of these little, you know, complexes, or it stores all of the memories in a similar file. So if I was talking about abandonment complex, like I said, which is one of mine, abandonment complex, when you open up that file, you're going to find there's several different stories in there from different angles. Right? I always say it's like the soul experiments with the theme, or once it sets its foot onto a path, quite frequently that theme is then played out in all different variations. So, you know, in some lives I was the abandoner, then I was abandoned, then I was orphaned, then I was left by a lover, you know, all of these different variations on it. Now, there are some stories that get very close or can be considered core to the complex, and if you can get to that one immediately, that can loosen and unravel the whole complex. You still may need to do some, you know, cleaning up, but you know, there isn't any standard answer as to how many sessions. I mean, generally you can make some big strides in one session. Again, depending on how deep it gets to the core of the complex.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Ariana has a question.
Hi, Patricia. This just got me thinking that this is gonna sound funny no matter how I say it, I think, but I see this as like residual energy that's like left here on Earth that we are sending home. So in a way, is this sort of like unhaunting places?
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Your question?
Oh, got goosebumps.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, get this. Some of those little soul fragments that are walking around doing their little repetitive thing, like crossing the road and crossing the road, some of those are yours.
My mother even told me that she sees me in her home, like the home I grew up in.
Yeah.
I swear, and I live 2 hours away from her. She's like, I just saw you walk by. I'm like,
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. So some of those are yours, perhaps from current life, but also past life. You know, I mean, if you, I had a life in, you know, where I was actually a young Polish boy and I was pushed onto the trains in the Holocaust. And I actually died on the train. I never even made it to the camp. But I lived in Germany. And when I went to Germany, I was so instantly dissociated. Because literally, I was in the area where my own soul fragment was still earthbound, still in terror. And I had panic attacks because I died on the train of like in the corner, you know, like, and all the suffocation and all of that. I died in absolute panic. And I used to have panic attacks from planes, trains, and automobiles, anything closed, a closed space like that. And on top of it all, I lived in Germany, right? And when I went to Germany, it was an extremely soul fragmenting, dissociating experience. Basically, I was running into my own soul fragment there.
Wow. Wow, we need to do a program on the Holocaust. We've had so many
Oh, yeah.
many
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And you had a question?
Hi, well, kind of, that's pretty much was
then my question was, does that fractal, I'm Jenny, by the way, hi.
Hi.
Hi, the soul fractal, like the example of the woman, the medieval woman, that soul fractal energy is left in that place, and that essentially could be a haunting. So
Yeah.
as you were asking that question, my heart rate like just went like 130, I mean 103, 104. And then when you were talking about your experience with going back and having the panic attack. So I identify as a medium, but like, and almost to the point, like what you were just saying, everything's synchronicity today, about being woken up in the middle of the night, right? Like I'm constantly bombarded by all these energies, but they're not always, and I can identify a ghost, you know, I can identify but there's so many like little like impressions of energies that I'm bombarded with. And I've never been able to understand what it is. And like my mind is like blown right now because just what you explained made a lot of experiences I've had in my life with these other energies just all made sense to me. Like all made sense that they're not necessarily a haunting of a ghost or whatever, but they're these little
Other people's, what I call other people's soul fragments.
Thank you.
Or your own. Like I said, there's still parts of us hanging around in village squares, you know, by our necks or, right? I mean, this is those parts of us that died those traumatic deaths and didn't get to the intermediary bardo. They are little hauntings, you know?
This is awesome. And you know, all of these different modalities and you have so many that you intertwine together. It
Yeah.
really gives us a way to be able to bring wholeness to all of these aspects of ourselves. So I'm so thrilled you were able to join us this year.
Well, and I think we're very fortunate to live in our time where we have so many great modalities that we can combine and reassemble all of these, you know, fragmented parts of our soul, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and I can't recommend Patricia's training enough. So April, I think you said, is the next
Yeah, March or April, I'll do another level 1.
level.
Yeah.
Okay, and she's only you do it in North Carolina, right?
I will be probably, yeah. I'm waiting for the retreat center to confirm dates because they're going through some renovations. But yeah, we're shooting for March, April.
Yeah, that's not too far away from us.
I know. Well, it'll be up on my website. I'm going to work on finishing the other website so I can put it up, and then all that stuff will be on there. That's another
So
book.
I'm gonna hold on a second. We had a question about your book. So I want to hold up. I don't have the book with me. I forgot to bring it, but I had a picture of it. So Understanding Karmic Complexes. And thank you for bringing that up because now we're going to have a drawing for a copy of that book. Asheville. And the winner is Peggy Franz.
Oh,
She's
okay.
online. She's online, so I will get her copy of the book.
Yeah, you're going to send me the info and I will mail it to her.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right.
And I'm going to sign it and send it to her.
Yay!
Yay!
Even better, even better. Isn't that exciting? And again, Patricia, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd love to know more about your evolutionary astrology. So let us know when you're doing something on that too. We'll share it with our community.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
So
Bye. Thank you so much.
thank you. We'll take a break and be back at 3:45. Yep, right. We're not too far off on time, so we'll be back at 3:45. And boy, do we have some treats for you.
No tricks, right?
No tricks. Well, maybe a trick.
Patricia? Patricia Walsh. Regressionist. Hi, Patricia, period. I attended your presentation today, period. I'd asked about the training, period. I've also signed up for your email list from your website, period. But in case you are keeping some other kind of list of people who are interested in your training, comma, please put me right at the top of that list, exclamation point. I am doing regression therapy, comma, and astrological consultation, comma. I love using the two together, comma, and I love your book, exclamation point. But there's more that I need to understand about deep memory, comma, and soul retrieval, period. I should be retiring, comma, at almost 60 years old, comma, but I've just started doing this work a few years ago, comma, and it's my life's passion, comma, discovered a little late, exclamation point.